I want to start with something most financial commentary gets fundamentally wrong. The mainstream financial media, the talking heads on cable television, and the endless stream of internet pundits are currently obsessed with pushing a terrifying, apocalyptic narrative about the absolute collapse of the global petrodollar system, blaming this massive macroeconomic shift entirely on a coordinated predatory attack by foreign adversaries, specifically pointing to the rise of the BRICS nations and their supposedly unstoppable push for new UN-denominated trade agreements as the absolute catalyst for the rapidly dissolving American financial empire. They desperately want you to believe that this historic transition is a hostile external takeover designed to trigger a massive economic crisis that will inevitably leave everyday American citizens as the helpless victims of a ruthless new global order. But that terrifying narrative is a profound cyclical versus structural misunderstanding of what is actually happening behind the closed doors of the global energy markets and within the secretive vaults of the world's most powerful sovereign wealth funds. The actual truth, which is far more consequential and fundamentally more important for your personal wealth, your family's future, and your long-term financial security, is that the ongoing dismantling of the petrodollar system is essentially an inside job, a direct, calculated, and unavoidable result of American energy independence and the quiet, structural repositioning of our own strategic national priorities over the last decade. To truly understand the magnitude of this shift and what it means for your money, we have to look back at the absolute origins of this exorbitant privilege, specifically examining the non-negotiable, world-changing bargain that was quietly struck in 1974 when the United States government, reeling from the disastrous aftermath of the gold standard shock and a crippling domestic energy crisis, made a brilliant, unprecedented geopolitical maneuver by officially agreeing to provide absolute military protection for the Saudi royal family in exchange for the ironclad guarantee that all global crude oil would be priced, bought, and traded exclusively in United States dollars. This ingenious, historically unprecedented system instantly created a massive, durable, and continuous artificial demand for the American currency, as sovereign nations around the entire globe were suddenly forced to acquire and hold massive reserves of United States dollars simply to purchase the essential energy required to keep their cities illuminated, their factories operating, and their domestic economies functioning without interruption. This incredibly powerful system naturally led to the automatic, continuous recycling of those massive surplus petrodollars back into the American financial ecosystem, specifically funneling trillions of dollars directly into United States Treasury yields and long-duration bonds, which effectively provided a massive structural safety net for the entire American economy, keeping our domestic interest rates artificially low, easily funding our massive, continually expanding government deficits and allowing the standard American retirement portfolio to grow consistently for decades without the true existential threat of runaway domestic inflation or a catastrophic system-wide bond market failure. But that specific golden era of guaranteed foreign capital inflows is now permanently over, not because of some secret adversarial meeting in Beijing or Moscow, but simply because the United States fundamentally and irreversibly changed the entire global energy map by aggressively unleashing the domestic shale revolution, unlocking massive, previously inaccessible domestic oil and natural gas reserves, and eventually becoming the undisputed largest producer of energy in the entire world. A stunning reality that completely surpassed the combined production capabilities of our former strategic partners in the Middle East and effectively removed the foundational underlying necessity of the original 1974 petrodollar agreement. Because the United States no longer relies on importing massive quantities of Middle Eastern crude oil to sustain its domestic economy, the vital geopolitical imperative to maintain a massive, incredibly expensive military presence in that specific region to protect those specific vulnerable supply lines has slowly but continuously evaporated. And consequently, those oil-producing nations are no longer strictly bound by economic necessity or military reliance to funnel their massive ongoing energy profits back into our treasury markets, which is exactly why we are currently witnessing a historic, undeniable decline in international foreign demand for our sovereign debt. Let me walk you through exactly what that means for your portfolio, because this continuous mechanical breakdown of Treasury bond demand is undeniably the single greatest, most immediate threat to the traditional conservative wealth-building strategies that have been universally prescribed to the American public by mainstream financial advisors for the last 40 years. When the continuous massive inflow of foreign capital into our domestic bond market begins permanently drying up, the foundational underlying safety net that has historically protected the standard widely utilized 60-40 investment portfolio is suddenly and violently removed, leaving your traditional 401k, your corporate pension plan, and your supposedly safe, reliable fixed income retirement savings incredibly vulnerable to a brutal, system-wide repricing event that most retail investors are completely unprepared to navigate. As the federal government continues to aggressively issue massive, unprecedented amounts of new national debt to fund its ongoing daily operations and massive entitlement programs, the sudden, glaring lack of guaranteed automatic foreign buyers means that domestic American investors and institutions will naturally demand significantly higher yields to willingly absorb that massive influx of new debt, which mechanically and ruthlessly forces the actual underlying value of existing, previously issued long-duration bonds to plummet dramatically, potentially devastating the conservative income-focused portfolios of millions of retirees who falsely believed they were completely protected from severe, catastrophic market volatility. This ongoing bond market deterioration is not a temporary fleeting dip or a simple cyclical fluctuation that will quickly resolve itself. It is a permanent, deeply entrenched structural shift in the fundamental global financial architecture that desperately requires an immediate, clear-eyed, and aggressive repositioning of your personal assets if you truly want to preserve your hard-earned capital and actually continue to grow your generational wealth in this new, highly unpredictable, and rapidly evolving macroeconomic environment. But while this historic systemic transition presents a profound, undeniable danger to those investors who stubbornly remain fully exposed to the dissolving old system, it simultaneously creates a massive, once-in-a-lifetime generational opportunity for those astute individuals who actually understand the new, underlying geopolitical realities and who are deeply willing to look far past the mainstream media's daily fear-mongering to accurately identify the massive tectonic shifts in global capital flows. The absolute end of the traditional petrodollar system strictly necessitates a massive, coordinated geographic pivot by the American government, a strategic, highly calculated inward retreat by the United States military and economic apparatus to firmly secure its own hemisphere, fundamentally and permanently transforming the economic landscape of the Americas as Washington finally realizes it must aggressively build a new, impenetrable, and fully integrated supply chain right here in our own immediate backyard. Now, I want you to deeply consider the massive strategic context of this monumental pivot to the Western Hemisphere, because as the United States slowly pulls back from its exhaustive, decades-long role as the ultimate global policeman in the fractured Middle East, it is simultaneously being forced headfirst into a new existential and incredibly high-stakes race for the specific vital resources that will absolutely define the next century of global economic supremacy and military dominance. The future of global power is no longer strictly about controlling the flow of traditional crude oil. The new, brutal global competition is a desperate, relentless, and highly contested critical mineral war, primarily driven by the massive, absolutely unprecedented energy and hardware demands of the explosive artificial intelligence revolution, the rapid government-mandated electrification of the entire global transportation fleet, and the highly advanced, resource-intensive defense technologies fundamentally required to maintain absolute superpower status in an increasingly hostile multipolar world. These incredible new technologies mathematically require staggering, almost incomprehensible amounts of specific raw materials, including copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and various rare earth elements, critical resources that the United States currently and quite dangerously relies heavily on hostile foreign adversaries to mine, process, and supply, creating a massive, glaring strategic vulnerability that simply cannot be tolerated or allowed to continue in a fractured world where the old, reliable, globalized trade networks are rapidly and violently dissolving. To permanently solve this glaring national security crisis, the United States government and massive multinational corporations are quietly but aggressively turning their full attention directly south, desperately looking to rapidly integrate the massive, historically untapped resource wealth of Latin America and the Caribbean basin into a new, highly secure, and tightly controlled regional American supply chain. We are already clearly seeing the early, undeniable stages of this massive strategic shift with the quiet, ongoing structural readjustments regarding American foreign policy toward Venezuela. A complex nation sitting on the absolute largest proven heavy oil reserves on the entire planet, which, despite decades of intense political tension, crushing economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation, is simply too incredibly strategically important to the future of the American energy grid to be left entirely to the predatory influence of foreign adversaries like China and Russia, as the United States desperately seeks to legally secure reliable, massive, heavy crude supplies significantly closer to home. But the real, truly historic generational opportunity, the massive, completely hidden wealth-building catalyst that the mainstream financial media is currently completely ignoring and failing to understand, lies quietly in a fascinating place most average American investors have absolutely not thought about as a viable investment destination for several decades. A heavily isolated nation sitting just 90 short miles off the coast of Florida that literally holds the geological key to permanently solving the massive American critical mineral crisis. I am specifically talking about the island nation of Cuba, an incredibly complex country that has been artificially frozen in time, deeply economically isolated, and systematically ignored by massive American institutional capital for well over 60 years. Yet it quietly sits directly on top of some of the absolute largest, highest quality, and most easily accessible natural deposits of essential nickel and cobalt on the entire planet. High-grade nickel and cobalt are the absolute, strictly non-negotiable foundational chemical elements mathematically required for the massive production of the high-density lithium-ion batteries that exclusively power modern electric vehicles, the massive, highly complex grid-scale energy storage systems required for renewable energy, and the increasingly massive, incredibly power-hungry hardware infrastructure required to sustain the explosive, exponential growth of artificial intelligence data centers across the country. Right now, at this exact moment in history, the Chinese Communist Party heavily dominates the global processing and advanced refining of these exact critical minerals, effectively holding a massive, highly dangerous geopolitical choke point over the entire future of American technological advancement and domestic manufacturing, a predatory monopolistic advantage that Washington is now desperately, aggressively trying to systematically dismantle through massive reshoring policies, massive federal subsidies, and the highly strategic securing of localized allied supply chains. But the simple, undeniable geological reality of the situation is that you absolutely cannot successfully build a truly secure, massive Western Hemisphere-based critical mineral supply chain without eventually, inevitably unlocking the massive, untapped geological potential of Cuba, simply because the sheer staggering scale of their unexploited natural resources is mathematically and industrially required to fully meet the massive projected demand of the American industrial base over the course of the next 2 decades. For well over half a century, the basic political optics of openly engaging with the Cuban government have been completely toxic in Washington. A stubborn, lingering relic of the Cold War era that has successfully kept massive American mining corporations and aggressive exploration companies completely locked out of one of the most incredibly lucrative, resource-dense geological basins in the entire world, while highly aggressive foreign competitors have slowly, quietly tried to establish permanent footholds in the vital region. But as the global critical mineral war rapidly intensifies and the harsh, undeniable structural reality of the completely dissolving petrodollar system violently forces the United States government to finally prioritize hard, tangible economic security over incredibly outdated historical political grievances, the eventual systemic normalization of bilateral economic relations with Cuba is no longer just a vague diplomatic possibility. It is rapidly becoming a strict, mathematically unavoidable strategic imperative for the survival of the American technology sector. When that massive, inevitable political thaw finally happens, and the historic decades-old trade embargo is fundamentally adjusted, legally modified, or completely dismantled, to officially allow massive waves of American institutional capital to finally flow freely into the deeply underdeveloped Cuban mining sector, it will instantly trigger an absolutely unprecedented flood of direct foreign investment, a massive structural repricing of related regional assets, and a truly historic monumental wealth transfer that will massively reward the brave early adopters who truly understood the strategic economic geography of this massive global transition before the broader market caught on. This massive prediction is not just idle speculation or wishful thinking. We actually have a highly accurate, incredibly detailed historical precedent for exactly this specific kind of massive geopolitical wealth transfer. And if we carefully look back at the absolute last time the entire global financial system underwent a structural macroeconomic transformation of this incredible magnitude, the direct historical parallels to our current situation are absolutely staggering and deeply revealing. In the summer of 1971, when President Richard Nixon officially and suddenly suspended the direct convertibility of the United States dollar into physical gold, effectively and permanently dismantling the entire Bretton Woods global financial system that had strictly governed all international finance and trade since the absolute end of the Second World War, the immediate mainstream economic consensus was one of absolute unmitigated panic, with widespread terrifying fears of a total catastrophic economic collapse and the absolute end of American post-war prosperity. The entrenched financial establishment loudly and repeatedly warned the American public that without the strict discipline of the gold standard, the American dollar would rapidly become completely worthless. Rampant hyperinflation would completely destroy the savings of the American middle class, and the entire global trade system would instantly fracture into violent chaos, leaving everyday retail investors as the primary, helpless victims of a highly predatory, incredibly unstable new financial paradigm. But the actual historical reality of the massive 1971 Bretton Woods collapse was fundamentally and entirely different from the terrifying mainstream predictions. Instead of completely destroying the American domestic economy, that massive structural shift directly unleashed a massive, unprecedented, multi-decade structural boom in consumer credit, corporate equities, and commercial real estate, creating a massive, unstoppable wave of true generational wealth for the astute investors who clearly understood that the fundamental rules of the financial game had simply permanently changed, not actually ended. The terrified investors who stubbornly clung to the dying old system, who fearfully hoarded physical gold at the exact wrong historical moment and foolishly kept their valuable capital completely trapped in low-yielding, supposedly safe traditional assets, were fundamentally and permanently left behind. their actual purchasing power slowly but aggressively eroded by the massive new inflationary realities of the modern fiat currency system, while those forward-thinking individuals who aggressively and intelligently repositioned their personal portfolios to directly align with the new structural macroeconomic dynamics reap truly exorbitant, life-changing financial rewards. Today, right now, we are all collectively standing at the exact same kind of monumental historical precipice, actively living through the exact same kind of massive global structural transition, as the entire world economy violently adjusts to the undeniable end of the traditional petrodollar and the chaotic, incredibly volatile birth of a massive new, highly resource-driven, multipolar geopolitical order. The old comfortable rules of passive investing, the blind, unquestioned faith in the traditional 60-40 portfolio, the deeply entrenched, unquestioned reliance on long-duration government bonds to continuously provide absolute portfolio stability, and the incredibly naive assumption that the massive, highly globalized international trade networks of the last 30 years will magically continue to function smoothly without interruption, are all fundamentally and irreversibly dissolving right before our very eyes. If you foolishly choose to leave your entire life savings and retirement accounts fully exposed to this rapidly decaying old paradigm, if you willingly ignore the massive, undeniable mechanical breakdown of global treasury bond demand, and if you completely fail to recognize the profound, historically significant implications of the United States aggressively pivoting its entire strategic economic focus directly back to the Western Hemisphere, you are dangerously leaving your entire financial future incredibly vulnerable to a historic, devastating repricing event that will systematically and ruthlessly drain the accumulated wealth from those who stubbornly refuse to adapt to the new reality. But if you can successfully look past the daily, overwhelming fear, if you can intelligently ignore the endless, deafening, cyclical noise of the mainstream financial media and instead focus your absolute attention on the underlying structural realities of the global energy and highly competitive critical mineral markets, you can highly strategically position yourself and your family to successfully front-run one of the absolute greatest, most lucrative wealth-building opportunities in modern financial history. The massive, historically undeniable and rapidly accelerating shift toward permanently securing vital natural resources like heavy Venezuelan crude oil and massive deposits of high-grade Cuban nickel and cobalt is absolutely not a distant, vague, or highly theoretical future possibility. It is a massive, present-day, ongoing economic reality that is already actively beginning to dramatically reshape the entire global flow of massive institutional capital and completely redefine the core strategic investment priorities of the world's absolute largest sovereign wealth funds and massive multinational industrial corporations. The absolute secret, highly lucrative investment location that the mainstream financial media has completely and utterly ignored for over 60 long years is directly about to become the absolute vital epicenter of a massive, unprecedented new industrial boom, a highly localized, incredibly profitable renaissance of massive resource extraction and highly advanced technological manufacturing that will absolutely create massive, highly durable, and deeply consequential generational wealth for the astute investors who are smart enough and brave enough to aggressively enter the market long before the massive, slow-moving institutional capital finally arrives. You have a massive, incredibly important choice to make right now. You can either be a helpless, unprepared victim of the rapidly dissolving global petrodollar system, passively watching your supposedly safe, highly traditional fixed income retirement assets utterly collapse under the crushing weight of significantly higher sovereign yields and massive domestic inflation. Or you can actively take absolute control of your own financial destiny, aggressively preserve your hard-earned capital, and massively grow your long-term wealth by highly intelligently aligning your personal investments directly with the absolute, undeniable, strictly non-negotiable strategic, military, and economic imperatives of the United States federal government as it desperately fights to maintain its absolute global dominance in the massive, ongoing artificial intelligence and global electrification revolutions. The long, complex history of the global financial system is an endless, continuous cycle of massive creation, total destruction, and profound systemic transformation. And in every single distinct historical era, the absolute greatest, most legendary financial fortunes are always made by those rare individuals who can highly accurately identify the massive, underlying structural shifts long before they are universally recognized, accepted, and priced in by the broader, slower retail market. The absolute end of the historic, exorbitant privilege of the traditional petrodollar system is absolutely not the tragic end of American domestic prosperity, but it is absolutely, undeniably, the absolute end of the highly passive, incredibly low-effort traditional investment strategies that have completely dominated the massive financial planning industry for the last 4 decades. It is finally time to completely wake up, clearly recognize the massive, incredibly lucrative geopolitical transition that is currently underway globally, and immediately take the absolutely necessary, highly calculated steps to actively protect your family from the massive, impending, and highly destructive crisis in the global sovereign bond market, while simultaneously strategically positioning your entire personal portfolio to fully capture the massive, truly immense, and deeply generational upside of the rapidly approaching Western Hemisphere critical resource boom. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe.